it in patches, so in sections. And I was curious as to who made this decision to upgrade the road. Why is it upgraded in patches and other places are being left ungraded? And who is the contractor who is doing this business? Where is the money coming from? So I was curious. And because my father considers himself a rural elite, having retired as a teacher, I went and asked him, do you know who is the contractor who is building this road? As a daily user of this road, because that's what he is, the user of this particular piece of infrastructure, did anybody consult you about how best to go about upgrading it and what they should do? And he was surprised because he actually knew very little. He knew as little as I did about where the money was coming from, who the contractor was, how much it was costing, when it was going to be finished. So he and I had a long story about this. I really pushed him very hard. I said, look, as a user, as a beneficiary, you should have this information and this data in your fingers. You should know who the contractor is, how much it is costing, who makes the decisions. And he was quite embarrassed, and therefore he took it upon himself to actually go out and search for this information. And it was not easy. It was actually very difficult to even figure out who made the decisions about how this piece of infrastructure was going to be handled. And I was quite surprised, and he was even more surprised. Because of that experience, he has now made himself kind of somebody to be harassing the administration about information about what's going on now in that area, about health centers, about dispensaries and all that. And so let me tell you what open data means to me. Open data means to me when my father, who is a fairly well-informed person, will be able to easily access all the information he needs as a citizen about the services that the government is able to provide to him. And not just information in the sense of files in some ministry department, but information because now he's a gentleman who uses what is called a smartphone. He is very proud of his smartphone, that he'll be able to get on to somewhere, some site somewhere, and be able to get the data about how much it cost to rebuild his road, who the contractor was, who was the decision maker, and he can use that information to then hold those people to account so that he gets his road built well. That's what open data in Africa will mean to me. Obviously, that's just an anecdote. It's much more than that. But I thought I'll use that anecdote to explain to you what I think it will mean for Africa. Thanks.
Thank you, Robert. I want to, you made a statement there that caught my ear. Open data means people able to access government data, right? So we have two government statisticians general here. What does open data mean to you, Dr. Chua? How much should be open? Should it all be open for us to scrutinize? Or are there boundaries? What does it mean to you, Dr. Chua?
Thank you very much, moderator. Good morning, everybody. To me, data revolution means generating more data, running away from the traditional sources of the data to the modern way of generating data. And of course, I'll continue saying, data revolution in the African context, to concentrate on generating more data, is to generate data to right people at right time and right format of the data. This is in African context. Secondly, I would say, of course, African governments, we should continue open data. And we are doing so. We do open our data. Open data revolution thing is an opportunity to be tapped. Job creation is through this open data thing that we are saying. And as I'm sitting here as the head of NSCO, I'll say sincerely, data revolution, open data, any national statistical officers should be gatekeeper. TAWEZA, they may have a technology that if it could be employed in data collection, for instance, will cut down cost. The other one is principles and standards. Data revolution, open data, real principles and standards has to be adhered to. There's no way out that we can run out of that. And the other part is capacity and resources. And I'm sorry, I have to say this straight. Africa governments, in terms of resources, of course, bear with me that we are saying open data revolution is costless. No. At a starting point, some cost has to be incurred. Set up the infrastructure, for instance, in Africa, skills, and so on. So we have to take on board this to ensure we have this data revolution, that we have to fill the data gap, that will create opportunity and facilitate citizens to put our governments into accountable. For me, I would say data revolution is about accountability to everybody, not only for the government only. Transformation. If we don't have this data revolution everywhere, how are you going to transform from point A to point B? So this is quite a very important thing. Results. We are now moving towards 2015 post-development agenda. So we have to demonstrate, really, we abide to these 17 SDGs that we are saying. So it's only this data revolution thing that will tell us exactly how to go forward. So let me end there, and then I'll leave my brother Pali Lehola to add on what I've said. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chua. Benga, let me ask you this. You are, I'm going to call you an activist in the data space. For those of you who don't know, Benga was in the middle of that Occupy Nigeria movement when the government reduced the subsidies, and Benga on Twitter with other friends of ours were involved in putting the people out and asking them to demand greater accountability on the government of Nigeria about the data, about the fuel subsidy. What excites you about open data, and how do you define, is this a revolution in your mind, or is it just an evolution?
I think it's clearly a revolution. For the African, and I'll borrow the phrase you used, the African context. So we've been a group of people who were literally powerless in the face of government. Our government had all the power, took all the taxes, and chose when to use it or not, most times not using it. And our citizens were literally helpless. But now with data, even when it's not willingly released by governments, there is a way data always finds a way out. And that's why I think that it's a shame when any government hides data, because data will always find a way out. Somebody within the system would eventually give a friend some information that will go out. And I think that the example of the protests that happened in Nigeria was because a number of people found out for the first time the real value or the real amount of waste that was going on. I mean, it was very simple. So for example, we found out as citizens that government, well, the presidency alone spent about $5,000 on breakfast, $5,000 on lunch, and $5,000 on dinner. Now, if the presidency does that, what should the millions of people spend? And that kind of data becomes not just data, it becomes information, and it becomes knowledge, and it empowers you. And in that case, the expression of it was in anger, and people went on the streets and made demands. And I'm sure that has changed the relationship. If you followed the last elections in Nigeria, you would see that a lot of people were speaking and asking questions based on, some based on assumptions, but a lot based on questions, practical questions. This is what you've done before. So I got involved. I had my preferred candidate, right? Thankfully, he won. But the only thing I could do was I saw that people were saying things that were not true about this candidate, and the only way to respond to that was to put data out there. So we put up a website called, what's the name again? I've forgotten. I don't remember the name of the website. Well, the president won, that's fine, so job done. But, factchecking.ng, fact-checking, okay, factchecking.ng. And what we did was everything that was said about him, he's a religious extremist, he's a this, is that, we took that information, we broke it down, and gave people data to run with. Was it useful? Maybe. Was it useful? I think so. So the idea of data becoming information and becoming knowledge and becoming a powerful tool is what makes this a revolution. But I think it's not just about what citizens are able to get from government. I think it's also about economic empowerment. I'm one of those people who used to carry laptops into hotels that had free Wi-Fi because I couldn't afford data packages. Okay, and we will spend that kind of leak, data leak, Wi-Fi leak we could get to do any kind of work. But right now, in all of Yaba in Lagos, Nigeria, young people are building businesses. Imagine how many businesses will be built if a government releases data on health services in the country. So it's not just about accountability to people, it's also about building businesses. If you build those businesses, you will get more revenue and you will have a better economy. But finally, I would even say that it's also in terms of national planning. National planning. Imagine there are many of our countries struggling with security issues, right, with terrorism and all that. Imagine if data on some of the security issues are out in the open and people are able to plot scenarios. Nigeria had the Matisane issues in the 70s and 80s, and now we're having Boko Haram right now. And we almost didn't see a relationship between the two until we began to see that the trends were about the same. Open data is not just about accountability of governments, it's also about economic opportunities, and it helps in national planning. There are people who will look at the numbers from the 1960s to date and will tell you where the country can go in the next 10 to 20 years. So I think it's a revolution, it's powerful, and it's not everyone who will smile about this.
Not everybody will smile about open data. That's a good point. And you also you said three things which let's try and link them up. Data, information, knowledge. Maybe a fourth one might be action. Mr. Lehotla, you are responsible for the statistics of South Africa. Not every one of us in here or out there following on Twitter is a statistician, or they know what to do or not to do about all of these numbers that in fact, many of us are afraid of numbers. How do you generate, outcomes, jobs, economic growth, accountability? What is the role of a statistician, statistics officers in translating data into value such as those? What do you do in South Africa? How can you make that revolutionary? How do you make numbers revolutionary?
Thank you very much. I suppose that statisticians have always been very revolutionary. If you look at the developments of technology itself, from scanning technology to try and process censuses to these handheld devices, most of these innovations have been driven by statistical agencies. If you look at the Tiger files that the US Bureau of Census used, those were driven by the US Bureau to try and delimit areas through which will be portals for information at small area level. So the revolution for statisticians is not necessarily new. Data itself is defined as unstructured observations, and we need to try and, as we talk about and get excited about revolution, we actually have to make the distinctions very clear in the disciplines, because going forward, the delineation between the disciplines become very important. Unstructured observations can be very dangerous because they don't have time series. You have to transform them into statistics so that you can look at time series. And the biggest investment you can make in data are time series. Observations across time subjected to specific statistical procedures so that you can understand. Otherwise, you end up with a lot of correlations that may not make a lot of sense. So, a concept of data revolution is an anomaly in the absence of a statistical vanguard that deals with this in a way. So, adding on what my sister Chua is putting across, that there has to be a vanguard as we deal with this matters data. And at times, that's the elephant in the room as we talk about data revolution. Because in many instances, with the advent of these gadgets, sensors that passively collect information, we forget that data are basically unstructured observations. And you need statistical processes to make this meaningful. Florence Nightingale could have observed that people actually die in hospitals. She probably would have ended there because that would have been an observation. And say, well, the best is not to go to hospital, the best is to be in the war field. At least it will give you a possibility of survival. But she went further by observing these unstructured observations and applied statistical techniques and finally said, yes, we'll need antibiotics because when you have people in hospitals, there is infection in hospitals of bacteria and so on. And then she got this discovered bacteria. And this was a major revolution. But it was based on observations that had to be subjected to statistical processes. Is open data revolution possible? I have my doubts, very, very serious doubts. I suspect in relation to governments, yes, it should be. In fact, statistical offices are obliged by 10 fundamental principles to make the data open. But the gadgets that we have, ask Google to give you the algorithm, because when you talk about open data, you must also talk about open algorithms. And those algorithms are their bread and butter. So it's very difficult, and I find it very difficult to think and believe that an algorithm for producing certain things will be open. So the demand for open data has to go further to ask for open algorithms and question the issue of intellectual property. And at the heart of it are those kinds of things. So it's more the governance, the governance, the democratization, and democratization, if it has to occur, it has to deal with issues of intellectual property rights. And these intellectual property rights, while we understand that they may be necessary, but to the extent that they limit the utilization of data and privatize the commons, that represents a very big disservice to society. So the demand that we make to governments for open data, which basically, yes, it must be open, has to point the other direction to the private sector and look at issues of intellectual property and how that intellectual property must also be open, because you have to understand the algorithms by which certain things are generated. So creation of the commons, the tragedy of the commons, all those things are very, very difficult issues. So when you talk about open data, we should look at the political economy of data systems and development itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you for bringing that up. I want to explore that in a little while. Does data concentrate power? Does it reinforce existing power relationships? Will this revolution actually not be a revolution at all? It'll be a deeply conservative thing? We don't know. But Nena, let's talk a bit about what was beginning to raise the private sector. Here we keep talking about government must open data, government must open data, government must open data. So I watched a TED talk in preparation for this, which I've tweeted out there. And the lady says, look, there is this technology now. How many of you have Samsung smart televisions? Hands up. Okay, be warned, because apparently your television can listen to your conversations in your living room. And that data, that conversation, is no longer yours. They can spread it out there to whoever cares to listen. So what is the role of the private sector? How does the private sector interact with this whole idea of open data to, shall we say, protect civil liberties, protect private information? What is the private sector doing with this open data revolution or evolution?
Good morning. Forget about politics, forget about paper, let's talk money.
I knew you would.
Money, l'argent, pesa. That's what is of interest to private sector. Have you had the latest news in town? The Nigerian president and the vice president have declared their assets. And right now, I'm looking through The Nigerian president has about $150,000 in Nigerian money, less than that in one account in a bank in Nigeria. That's what he declared. He has no foreign accounts, and he has no companies in his name. He has about 200 heads of cattle, and some birds, some sheep, and some economic trees, he said. He has a few homes, and some of them are on earth. They are sand homes. But the vice president has declared $900,000 in his name. And more than, in all, he has more than $1 million to his name. And he has shares in many banks. So I woke up this morning, and Nigerian social media was abuzz with this news. And some Nigerian person who is not sitting very far from me is calling his stock agent and say, go and invest in the bank where the president has his bank account. Because you can be sure that bank is not going bankrupt in any time. Okay? So that is the basis of the issue. And he thinks he's being the smart one. I have sent a few emails based on the declaration of asset by the president. I myself am making my own business plans accordingly in my little corner. Now, that is the power of a few lines of open data from two people. Now, do you think when ministers will be nominated in a month, those ministers won't declare their assets? They have to declare their assets because the leadership has stepped forward. Now, as a business person, all we do is to track that data and know how to make smart use of it. One of the things that we do at the Web Foundation is open contracting data. And I have just tweeted that for the few years we've worked on it, we've helped countries look at over $95 trillion of money movement. Listen, Mr. Pali, we have great respect for government, but government is only as good as when it makes its people make money. So good government that does not make the people get richer, the government that does not give us money, we don't care for such governments. And that is why open data is good for everybody. Benga was talking about giving out health data sets. For us, it is very important if we want businesses to grow far, because you want to be able to plan, you want to be able to invest, you want to be able to show that you are gaining something. So when we release data sets, it helps everybody start working. It helps everybody start calculating. It helps people know where best to invest. The greatest problem we have in Africa may not be money in itself. It may be how best to make use of our money. Even in my tiny little corner, I'm looking at how best to invest my money. Africans, we are 1 billion, and I can tell you half of us can be investors. If we have the right information, if we have the right data, we will start investing where it is best for us. So let's not look at open data as something that is coming to us from very far. No, it is not. It is in this continent we produce the Africa Data Consensus. And I would like to pick on two things, Aidan, about the Africa Data Consensus. It is about a shift in the way we do things. The idea that it is the National Board of Statistics that is going to give us all the data we need, and so we are sitting down and we are waiting for Pali. No, that's wrong. There is a huge chunk of data with private sector. Even the civil society has data. And there are even third-party organizations that have been holding our data for so long. Everybody needs to contribute into the data Africa. We all need to be part of data contributors. We can't sit and wait for the work to be done by government alone. So we're looking at communities, private, public, civil society. We're all into it. Coming down to the money of it, I think it will be, what's the better word? It is fantasy to think that our problems as Africa will be solved by donor funding. It is not true. Donor funding is only one part of it, but it is our duty to develop ourselves. And if we do not invest in African SMEs and private sector, we won't get ourselves out of poverty. It is not $1 million that makes a country rich. It is a 10 shillings by many Tanzanians contributing it together. So finally, in closing on this rate, I would like to say that open data is needed at leadership. We need leadership in open data. We need leadership from everywhere. So civil society is going to contribute. Private sector is going to contribute. It is essential that every part of the society contributes and makes good use of it. So bottom up is very important. Top down is also very important. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question. You want to make money out of the data, right? Private sector wants to make money from, Benga said, health data. The government should release health data so that we can build businesses around it. Show of hands in the room here. How many of you would like your health data to be released to Benga here? Hands up. Not sensitive. You see, we're beginning to, so whose is this data? So is this data built on raw material which you and I create, right, for free? By the way, we pay to create this data. We buy data bundles, we create this stuff, we put it out there, and private business wants to make money out of it. I read the Statistics Act, which also compels citizens to release data. When they come and count you, you can't say, no, I'm not telling you how many children I have. Although some cultures, they don't want to count the number of children they have. Those are their blessings. If they count them, they're afraid that some of their blessings might disappear. But the government says, thou shalt tell me how many children you have, who slept here overnight, etc. So the government compels, and the private sector cajoles you, persuades you to release as much info. Whose is this? Robert, we're about public integrity and openness. Whose is this data?
No, first of all, I'm impressed by just the breadth and scope of the panel that you put together, because I think you've heard about the various aspects for which data can be and should be useful. I mean, obviously, we started talking about accountability, but we've ended up by saying that it's a lot more than about just the accountability piece. Now, whose data is it? So maybe I start by telling you an anecdote about a friend of mine who has refused to join Twitter or Facebook or any of these so-called social networks because she believes that it's, well, because she believes that it's just a way of private sector entities to vacuum data about her. Yeah. So I asked her, do you have credit cards and do you use them in the shops? Do you do online shopping? And I said, my friend, if you're there in those spaces, your data is already out there. Don't be under any illusion that your data is not being vacuumed because you're living off Facebook and off Twitter. And it's a big question about to what legitimate purposes can data that is yours, especially personal data, be used. And one of the things we don't acknowledge enough is that the private sector has cracked this nut. The private sector has cracked the nut of how to vacuum data about ourselves, how to utilize it not only to make business, to make more business, but for better informed policy making by the companies themselves in terms of who they should target as consumers, in terms of what they should. So on the private sector side, we who work in the public sector are almost clueless as to what is happening with our own data and how the private sector is using it. Now, there comes a big question, and I think it's one that we have not cracked, which is where do you draw this line between what should be public and what should be private, and what does private mean in this new big world? And I think it's a conversation that will continue to be held. I think the question of health data, for example, is an interesting one to consider, because there is data about the performance of the health sector that, frankly, can be useful if put out there to the public and for people to use to make businesses, to make decisions, and even for consumers to make decisions about themselves. But there's data about your health and your own individual health performance that has to remain yours and has to remain owned by you and privately owned by you. And where exactly that line is, I think many of us are struggling with. And it's not just here in Africa. In the United States, it's a big, big debate about even data that the government holds about you and how much it should use and hold. So I wouldn't say that we have solved it. I think it's a debate that will continue. But there is acceptance that to the largest extent possible, unless it is data that affects your own individual as a person, if it is data that is held by the government, by private sector companies, or civil society organizations, the idea would be to push the frontier of openness.
Thank you. Dr. Chua, when I was tweeting about some study that we had done as Twaweza about people's preference, voter knowledge, a few days ago, someone tweeted back and said, but you know, your data can't be legitimate because it has not yet been vetted by the National Bureau of Statistics, right? And I said, actually, no, they don't have to vet it because this is not official data. This is not official statistics. Let me ask you this. How open should government be? Because I think some people will say governments are talking a long game about open data, but they really don't believe in it. They really are just going with the flow because Robert says you must open up your data. So government says, okay, you know, is there really a sense that government of Tanzania is really keen and focused on opening up its data set, its data?
Aidan, let me start by saying that the government of Tanzania and African governments, we are already there. Our data, which I really concur with my brother, that data is unstructured. It has to be structured by applying statistical methods to make information that will inform decision-making and policy formulation. Now, coming to your question that how much should we open? I will start by official information. Of course, official information, this is the information that is being produced by following principles and standards. And my brother Pali said we have to follow the fundamental principles of official statistics. It's like Bureau of Standards. It's like ISO, international something. That's exactly. So data revolution thing saying you have to release, that's why I say data to right people, right data. Like what you released 2 days ago. I mean, what is going on in Tanzania right now. For me, as I'm sitting here on behalf of the government, that is your own source. However, we government, we do partner with private sector. Because private sector do, some of the job creation, many of it comes from the government. So there's no way out that we should close or reinvest ourselves without involving the private sector. So the information that you release is your own information, is from your own source. So there's no way that the government will come and say, oh, Twaweza, no, don't do that. But the issue that we are saying here is to build on the existing legal structure, institutional setup. And let me make this very clear. This data revolution thing, it has to come up with a policy. What is supposed to go under this data revolution, which I'm sure many countries have not yet produced the policy for this, which iron out stakeholders analysis thing, all the context that has to go to the data revolution, it has to be set up. Data protection. Because you can't release everything. You say Twaweza, you say Aidan. You can't release everything. There are some information that has to be remained and worked on. So in doing so, let me give you an example. For instance, that's why I'm saying NSO should be gatekeeper.
NSO meaning National Statistics Officers.
It has to be so. There is an issue of confidentiality for the information, for the data that we are collecting to the households, to the companies. For now, as I'm sitting here, the Statistics Act protect those heads of households, companies. The information that we are collecting there, you're not supposed to release those for the security purposes. So these are the things that really we need to look into it going forward.
Let me ask Benga. There's data. Sometimes we get caught up in the technology, you know, the smartphone, the internet, etc. I was in a village in Uganda where I thought there was a great example of open data. So in this sub-county near Soroti, there was on the notice board a breakdown of all the money they'd received from government and how it was spent. So that is open data, is it not? Are we getting seduced by the technology and how fast we can move around? Are there other forms? And is that actually more revolutionary in a way that the government accounts to its citizens just in newspapers, on a notice board? Isn't that as revolutionary as having it, you know, manipulated through this new technology?
So, to clarify, data revolution is not about a platform or the device. Okay. It's about the data itself. We find faster and easier and more scalable expression, more shareable formats through, of course, you don't want to share data using PDF versus sharing data using a spreadsheet because it's easier to manipulate the latter and also use it. So it's not, I think, there are two things to this. Number one is the fact that it's easier to use these tools to get the data. I mean, it's easier for me to check on my mobile phone than to walk all the way to my village to go and check on a notice board. That's one. Then secondly, there's a new generation of young people who are growing up with these devices. The only way, I was sharing this at the pre-meeting yesterday, that there's a generation that doesn't watch television anymore. The biggest screen that they watch is the screen of the iPhone 6S. And so this generation is not going to check the data anywhere else, but on their phones. But I think it's important for me to take a minute to clarify the health data that I mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
Just, to be clear.
You don't want my private health data?
I do not, campaign for private data to be released where it will hurt the person. If it's your private health data, it shouldn't be released, obviously. But there's data like who is doing what where, which places don't have health centers, what is their performance like. Those are the kind of data sets we're talking about. In education, nobody wants to see your child's results. We're asking about which schools are functional, where, things that can allow people to make investment decisions. And this is why the issue of privacy is important. In fact, my organization has sued the government of Nigeria through the ID card management company because biometric data is being collected by the banks, by the ID card company, by the immigration company, by the telecom companies, by who else? Like 8 of them are collecting biometric data.
And the
driver's license.
The electoral commissions?
Electoral commission has also collected, and there is no data privacy law. It means that if my data is misused and somebody who doesn't like me plants my biometric data in a scenario where there's terrorism to get me hooked up, it means that I have no legal recourse in court. So there are cases where privacy must be respected. But there's also the other extreme of governments that use security as an excuse for not releasing some data. And I think these are two things we need to manage properly. In the name of security, you cannot hide data of money you are stealing. It is anathema. Yeah. But of course, at the same time, we cannot release private information. We can't release the home address and the personal phone number of people just because we want, to give open data.
Unless you're Ashley Madison.
Yes.
Unless you're Ashley Madison. Anybody know about Ashley Madison? Google it. It's the greatest scandal in an open data field at the moment. Dr. Paddy, can I call you Paddy? You raised a very important point, and this is the tragedy of the commons. One of the most revolutionary moments in the English history was the enclosure movement, right? Suddenly the commons became privatized. Do you fear the same thing? That, land became enclosed and the landlords could basically own more land, right? Do you fear the same thing is happening with data? Is the private sector enclosing what really ought to be open and making oodles of money? Or do they have the right to do so because they have invested in collecting it? The Googles, the Ubers, the Facebooks. Is it actually not our data, but theirs?
Well, you see, the problem is the technology has made data non-rival. If it was printed on pieces of paper, it would probably be still rival. But it's non-rival because it is available on technologies.
Yeah.
So when I'm looking at my website here, you can look at the same website. In fact, everybody can at the same time. And that defies the logic of scarcity.
Okay.
Now, the problem is that the data that has been collected, probably passively, it's our individual data. But the private sector, the Googles, the WhatsApp, all those are using the technology to probably own what they don't own. We pay for this. There is a bit that we pay when we make a call. But locational data that the system generates passively cannot be their data. It's public data. It's a commons.
It's public data.
Yes, it's commons. It's a commons. The question is, can that commons be tapped into? Take, for instance, Orange and the question of Ebola. The world has gone out with a lot of gratitude about how the data was made available. One part of it is, was it right to provide private data of individuals, even if it's for good? Because it could be for bad. That's one. The second is, shouldn't it be a matter of course, that such data should be available anyway? So it's not a question of whether you are dealing with disaster. It's a question of that data which is collected passively, which is our data, my data, your data. It must be a commons. And there have to be laws that make it a commons so that it is not only available when there are disasters. Because prevention is better than cure. You can actually make this data available much, much earlier, all of it, in order to avert any disaster coming. The problem, however, is the disaster of the commons, which is, once it's a commons, and then, of course, we compete in terms of consumption of the commons. And greed goes in there, and that's where the disaster and the destruction of the commons come in. You have to have a process by which you protect the commons, and there you have to implement some laws. So data is non-rival, and because it's non-rival, my access, your access, and everybody's access doesn't stop it from being available. In fact, it becomes more beneficial when a lot of us are in that space. So when you look at the economics of data, really, it belongs to the commons, but unfortunately, it is controlled by just a few. And the direction is that they are making super profits out of it, and it shows that there is unfettered accumulation that is generated as a consequence. And of course, these guys become philanthropies. And whether it's a justified philanthropy, I do not know. I don't think it's correct.
Nena, I want you to pick up on that point. It's not your data to make money with. It's our data. It's common data. So shouldn't it be free, even once it's been processed? Here is what you look like. Here is how you behave, maybe at a certain level of aggregation and abstraction, so that you protect privacy. So is the private sector justified in, making money out of something that actually is freely available?
I don't understand why we equate making money with criminality. Making money is not a crime. We should make money. I mean, everybody needs to make their life better. Now, the question may be, I know this is unconventional, but Edith, what is the opposite of open data? Maybe that will help us
focus our thinking.
Yes. What will be the opposite? The opposite will be that every husband keeps his salary to himself, doesn't declare it to the family, the woman is guessing and she doesn't know,
Or the man.
or the woman keeps everything from the husband, and the children don't know what to ask for and not what to ask for. The opposite will be that every government official will treat his domain as his kingdom, and unless he signs it, nobody else can sign it. Unless he shows it, no one else can show it. And every ministry will treat itself like a country of its own, which actually, unfortunately, happens in many places. What that means is that we will hear that XYZ gave 10 billion shillings in loan to a country, and we don't know exactly what the loan is for. We don't know what it is being used for. We don't know who got the contracts for that job. And then we are asked that we are owing. We are told as citizens that we are owing. That is the opposite of open data. The opposite of open data is that nobody knows your email address, even as a public official. Nobody knows your portfolio. Nobody knows what you do, but then you collect money at the end of the month. That is the opposite of open data. The opposite of open data is that private sector, international mostly, sign contracts that citizens know nothing about in key economic areas, and we don't know if they are paying or they are not paying. We don't know the terms of the contract. We don't know how much they are making in profit. We don't know how much they are paying salaries for. And then one day they pack up and leave, and they just sack everybody. And the country is like, what is happening? We don't know how to pursue them. So that is the scenario when we do not go into openness in data. It is very important to realize what we are doing, okay? From the home to the national level. Every time someone thinks, I am the one alone to do this, then there is a problem. And there is, this can be very controversial. There should not be any reason for you to open data up. Data should be opened by default. That's what I believe. Respecting privacy. Data should be opened by default. Put it out there. Don't let me be the one telling you, writing you, dear sir, madam, I hereby wish to. No. Open up the data, and you should be the one that if you have to close it up, then you say, I wish to close this data set because 1, 2, 3. Yeah. So the people who should be given the reasons are the ones who don't want to open data. So don't criminalize people for using open data for innovation, for platforms to make money. Okay? I hope we get that one very clearly. It is something we are passionate about because we can't remain in this poverty because somebody somewhere thinks that money that belongs to all Tanzanians is his or hers alone and he's sitting on it. No way.
Very good, Nena. Now, we have some time, so I want to open it up a little bit now for your reactions, your opinions, your questions. But I want this to be a conversation rather than asking the panelists, because we have opinions, and so do you, and those of us over here don't necessarily have better opinions than you do. But I want to ask you this question. Remember I asked you, what does the internet see you as? And when I was watching this TEDx talk, the young lady was saying, look, institutionally or in the political economy, she went through this. Under feudalism saw most of us as serfs or slaves. Yeah? So you were a serf or a slave under feudalism. Under monarchies, how many people come from monarchies here? Hands up. There are a few. The Swedes, the Nepal used to be a monarchy. Under monarchies, you guys are subjects, okay? You're subjects. Under electoral systems, you're voters. That's your function in life. Nothing else. Just vote. That's how many politicians see you as. All you are voters. Under industrial capitalism, what are you? Consumers. All they care about is the size of your wallet. Market share, wallet share, this kind of thing. In the internet, what are you? Data bundles. Buena Bitang and them were saying, no, we're not, right? The internet only cares about the stream of zeros and ones that it can harvest from you every time you do something on a device or something on the internet, right? Now, in open data, do you think that this is now, maybe under open data, we can become citizens? If we do indeed own our own data, we can become actually maybe not citizens, but this other phrase, netizens. As Benga said, many of the young population are digital natives. The rest of you in here are digital immigrants. Right? There are digital immigrants, and your children are putting up barriers and walls and don't look at my password. Let me, have access to it. What are you? And what to you? I'm inviting some comments or questions. How do you see this data revolution, and what is your personal relationship with the whole notion of open data? So put aside a little bit your official hat, okay? I'm government, I'm civil society. What is your personal relationship with open data? How many of you here are on Twitter? Oh, very many. No wonder you're overwhelming the internet in this room, right? How many of you are on Facebook? How many of you are on Instagram? How many of you buy a newspaper? How many of you listen to a radio? Okay, you guys are all into open data. Most of you, right? Right? So, any comments or questions? Do you really feel yourself to be data bundles? Are you? Are you just raw material for the internet? Or are you netizens or citizens of the internet? Bitange, I know I can recognize you, so I'll call you by name. Yes, sir. I think you just lift your microphone there and press the button. I hope it works. Thank you.
I am seated here worried before I tell you whether I'm a netizen or whatever. Africa, sometime 2012, the UN Secretary General had a committee to look into this. This year, March, Africa adopted what we call the Open Data Consensus. We were just about to adopt the SDGs, which are underpinned by open data. And then when I see varied responses from Frontier, then I'm getting very worried, because these are netizens who should know more, and the people at home, those who implement, who don't know. If we argue this way, it will take us 15 years to understand SDGs, and that will be the end of it. We would not be able to change the continent. Internet has become the greatest leveler. We are the same people. We are equal. We have equal opportunities, equal in terms of what I need to say. So you can't say that there are people who are on the internet who have some privileges like the monarchies and stuff. So we have a technology that is completely levelized. We must leverage on that to provide data. And out of the data, we can deal with some of the pressing problems that Africa has had.
But your central point, Bitange, is that internet has leveled us. But I want to challenge you a little bit of that and maybe invite some other comments. It ought to be, that's the ideal. If you have access to the internet, then you are equal. But what if you don't? Is open data closed to you?
Actually, a good question. That's why NENA is seated there. And this is what we've been working on to make sure that the next 2 billion people access internet. That is the debate we should be having. How can everybody access this greatest leveler to create the same platform for everybody?
Okay, I'm sure we'll talk about that during the conference. There's some other hands that are going up. So let's go with Alex, and then we'll come to this end of the room, way over there from my friend. So make your points short and pithy. Alex,
okay.
And then we'll come to you. So
my name is Alex Awiti. I'm from Aga Khan University in Kenya. I think I would like to say that we're probably in a post-open data space. I think we should be speaking about big open data. And I think it is troubling that we still have this conventional notion that data has to be structured. There's going to be a set of variables that are codified, that are amenable to statistical treatment. There's a lot of unstructured data out there. You get into the internet and Facebook, a story is data. I think it is really the power of this space is going to be the integration and the mashing up of data to find patterns, to detect, to predict things, and to detect stuff and also model stuff. So we need to be thinking about what the internet and this great equalizing space is doing in terms of connecting people who are producing data. I think of myself not as just someone who's providing data to people out there, like my bank when I run my credit card, or when I open up my phone to find a location on the street. I am also contributing the data. I'm also consuming that data. So I think we're now netizens. We're citizens in that open data space, but it's big data. It requires collaboration, and we need to think more in interdisciplinary, holistic ways in terms of how we integrate this to find all the solution spaces that we need in that very broad diversity space. So I think it's a post-open data. We've now moved to big data because of the size and the variety and speed, which is really essentially what this is about. How quickly can you find stuff, and what's the platform and the possibility for integrating this data to ask multiple kinds of questions that you cannot ask just with population census data. How about if you throw in special data onto population? How about if you throw in income data onto that? How about if you throw in other kinds of other special explicit data sets that define fundamental attributes that you want to be looking at? Thanks.
Thank you, Alex. Yes, please introduce yourself and make your, I'd ask a question to make your point.
Thank you. My name is Sonigitu Ekpe. I'm from Nigeria. My own point is straight. We are aware that policies drive the economy of every nation. Then how do we address the lacuna on our various policies that allows for leakages and no legal infrastructure for measuring criteria for success?
Repeat your question, sorry. We heard about the lacuna, but I didn't quite hear the detail.
Yes, we have policies running our various countries. Now, there are lacunas in between the policies that do not allow for legal infrastructure, implying that there are no legal backings. There are leakages, so the defaulter is never punished. There are no criteria for measuring success of each of these policies because they are never continuous. Each government comes, I have this for education. At the end of the day, he stops. Another government comes, starts a new one, dumping the previous one, and then taking us backwards each time. How do we address this lacuna in those policies formulation?
Thank you. That's a good question. Robert, maybe I should ask you. The issue about, I'm going to call it sort of siloization of data. Each government department will collect its own data. You know, we'll have the immigration do passport and they'll ask for a biometric. Then the National Electoral Commission will do a voter ID and ask for biometric, and they don't talk to each other. What's your view on this? How do we improve the situation?
Look, I think the first thing is to acknowledge that a lot of this is still in infancy, yeah? Especially the ability of data to talk to each other. Let me give you a very quick example, and I'll be brief because it's a beautiful story, but it's a bit of a long one. So in a certain country in Central Europe, they had a problem about the fact that the distribution of schools within the country was heavily skewed by the fact that the country had an administration that was socialist previously. And the question was, how do they, the government was faced with this question. How do they politically manage to close schools in certain areas and open others where the schools were needed? And what they did was very interesting, was pick education data, mash it with budget data, and mash it with population data. And because these data pieces were able to talk to each other, the impact was therefore very powerful, and government was able to make the case politically of why to close schools in certain areas and open them in others. And that's a perfect example of when data talks to each other, the impact can be extremely, extremely powerful. So I think we will get there at some point, but it's going to take some time for it to be the natural way of doing business. And I think first is just to acknowledge that we have a long way to go, not just here in Africa, in other parts of the world, but I think that's the natural space we should be in.
Thank you. I know that there's probably lots more wanting to be discussed, but I'm told that the president is either here or on his way. So I'd like to ask you to thank our panelists, Nena and Paddy, Benga, Dr. Chua, and Robert, and Few for your great attention. And let's have fun and learn lots.